First, for our moderator, Satoria Ray. Satra reads on Instagram and TikTok. She's a bookish influencer who reads across genre and identity. Then our next panelist, we have award-winning journalist, celebrated poet, New York Times best-selling author, Emmy-nominated TV writer and storyteller, Michael Harriot. And lastly, New York Times best-selling author, national speaker, and public historian, author of How to Fight Racism, Young Readers Edition, Jamar Tisby.
Hello, 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 everyone. I am so excited to be here and to talk about attacks on DEI and to talk about reparations. So we're just going to jump right in. I wanted to start by talking about why it's so important for all of us to be students of history. I know oftentimes when we're seeing these attacks on DEI, a lot of questions that people have is like, how did we get here? Like, where did this moment start? And I know for people like you and people like me as a history educator, we're like, well, how much time do you have? But a lot of people don't know that this is not in isolation, that we can actually trace back across decades and even across centuries of how we got here. So why do you think it's so important to not only be a student of history, but how can it help us inform the actions that we can take in this moment?
So I don't think you can understand, first of all, why DEI and affirmative action and the argument for reparations exist unless you know the specific parts of history, right? Because unless you know history, right, unless you know that every white person that came here, when they brought someone else here or when they brought enslaved people here, they got 50 free acres of land. That's DEI, right? Right? Like, free stuff for white people is DEI, right? Like, that's how they built their economic base. Unless you know, for instance, that black people, the South Carolina Constitutional Delegation of 1868, created the education system as we know it. It did not exist before then. It exists now. What you know now is publicly funded education was created by black people. So you can't, unless you know that, you might think, well, black people don't really be valuing education. Unless you know that they had to get legislators to write laws that said we will kill them if they start reading, you might think that black people didn't value education. So the beginning, the baseline of all of this is the understanding of history.
I agree completely. Malcolm X said that of all of the subjects, history is most well positioned to reward our efforts. Or as I like to say, history has the receipts. And just like Michael said, all of these attacks on DEI, affirmative action, reparations, all of it has a history. But knowledge is power. And so I really believe that us not knowing our own history is disempowering. And there are also people out there who are actively trying to make sure that we don't know our history because they know that when we do it, we will gain some power to change the system as it stands. And so what I say is history is just stories. I don't know what your school or educational background has been, if it feels dry as dust to you. It is the most fascinating stuff about humanity because it's not just what we profess to believe, it's what we actually did. And so we can see what you truly believe and think by our actions, and that's what history's about.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, which brings me to my next question when thinking about history as not just like history, but histories, right? Like there are multiple versions of the same history depending on what lens you're looking from, but more importantly in this moment, like depending on who you're talking to. So when I'm talking to like a white person, for example, and I can ask them about the Boston Tea Party, but then I read your book, right, Black AF History, and I ask you about the Boston Tea Party, we're talking about the same event, but the story that I'm going to hear is going to differ. And it brings me to start with you, Michael, to talk about your book, because I feel like so many of us in this room have that moment where you're like, everything I learned in school was a lie, right? Like you have that moment where you're like, that's not how that happened. And when you start your book, you talk about how you were homeschooled. And there's this quote in there where you say, the reason that your mother homeschooled you was because she didn't feel like a black child could fully realize their humanity in the presence of whiteness. And I stopped and read that and was like, damn, because one of the things about white supremacy that we often talk about is that a white person doesn't have to be present for whiteness to be present. And so even if you went to a predominantly black school, right, there was whiteness all over your curriculum. And so when you sit down to write a book like the one you wrote, one, what was the inspiration? And two, what do you hope people are taking away when they're reading this book and they're getting this more liberatory for us black folks view of the same history that we were taught in school?
Okay, first, the inspiration was kind of when I started seeing the pushback on CRT, they were calling it CRT. You know, there's always another name for something that black people do. But when I started hearing the pushback, I understood where it was coming from. And where it was coming from is a thing that we don't like to acknowledge, that white people don't be knowing stuff. Right?
on.
Like, all of the stuff you know about history is just stuff that white people made up, but it's not true. And because I grew up, you know, my mom didn't necessarily sit me down and say, I'm going to teach you how they be lying. I just didn't learn the lies. Like, I never learned the lies. So when I started going to school and I was hearing the stuff that they were saying, I was like, oh, they're learning lies. So I understood that when they talk about, you know, the racist founding fathers, white people don't be knowing that most of them had slaves. They just didn't know, right? They didn't, when they say, well, that's how it was back then, they didn't know that there was an abolition movement for every day that this country existed. Black people were fighting slavery and white people were fighting slavery. It was not how it was back then, right? It was something white people wanted to do, right? That form of human subjugation never existed. So once you know that, and you want to tell the stories from black people's perspective, you don't even have to say, this is what white people think. Just tell them the truth. And you realize, like, people will think it's something different, but it's really just removing the white lies and just giving people the unfiltered truth.
Yes, thank you. We're going to take a pause real quick because our third panelist is here. Welcome, everyone, Dr. Nell Irvin Painter.
I'm fine. Let me stay.
Honored.
Hi.
So you want to go ahead?
So I'll just jump in on that question while we're getting settled here. This is where the disciplined study of history is important. There's the myth that history is simply objective. We just tell what happened. There's always selectivity in what you include and what you don't include, in what sources you go to, in what stories you choose to tell. And so it is a myth to think that there is some person out there or group of people out there who can just tell straight history. Everyone has a perspective. Everyone has a bias. Sometimes that bias is bad because they're intentionally obfuscating and leaving out stuff. But it doesn't have to be, right? You have a thesis. This is how you have historians. Yes, ma'am. This is what we're here for, right? And so don't always just go to whatever's on the bookshelf in the bookstore, because a lot of times those are not historians. It is a good start if you get books like Michael Harriot wrote, books like Dr. Nell Irvin Painter wrote, but be wary. Be wary and know where an author is coming from so that you can do. One last soapbox moment. We have to stop saying, well, they didn't teach me this in school. Probably not. I used to be a 6th grade teacher and a middle school principal, and I taught all black kids. And if they didn't learn the history, it's because we had this darn standardized test that we had to get them ready for, and we couldn't spend the time that we wanted to on the history. But at some point, we've got to take ownership of our own learning. And we live in something called the information age. So all of it is at your fingertips if you take ownership of the history that you wish you knew. And let's interrupt the cycle and make sure we pass it down to the next generation.
I wanna point out one thing. One thing is to jump in and say, like, I understand, like, we have to learn our history, but I also want to dismantle. I think it's time to dismantle the narrative that, like, black people got to learn all the white stuff and then put extra effort in to learn our stuff too. Like, why we gotta learn two versions of history, right? Like, we shouldn't have to do extra work to know the truth. And it's not like white history and then black history. It is a lie, and then we gotta put in extra work to learn the truth. So I think we gotta dismantle that narrative that, like, we gotta teach our kids. We do have to teach our kids all the morals and values and the stuff that relates to us. But we also have to ensure that black people don't have to do twice the labor to just get to normal. Why white people can just send their kids to school? White people ain't teaching their kids at home about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They just send them to school, let them read a history book, and they're done. And we should be able to do the same thing too with the truth.
Yeah, which I think you all, like, first of all, welcome, Dr. Painter. You're, like, right on time because they perfectly set you up for the question that I was going to ask. So in your most recent book, I Just Keep Talking, which is absolutely phenomenal, it has this beautiful combination of history alongside visual art, and it's a collection of your essays. And there's one particular essay in that book that's called Who Decides What is History, which, perfect timing. And in that particular essay, you're talking about why these perspectives of history, like we find in Michael's book, aren't in our textbooks, right? Like what they will reveal about America. And so what we've been talking about before you came in, and I think you're very well suited to continue the conversation, is about different perspectives of history and what is the risk of what Michael's book offers up being presented in a public school classroom. Why in this moment are we seeing Moms for Liberty, for example, take over school board meetings to try to disrupt what is happening, to try to prevent what is happening to, like, truth telling in history?
Thank you so. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience. I almost went home. This weather is defeating me. I'm from New Jersey. I didn't know where I was. I was totally lost. Feel sorry for me. Thank you. Okay. So I am a historian. I have a PhD in history from Harvard, and I've written lots of history books. And when I started writing history in the 1970s, history was very different from what it is now. So I think partly you're talking about the history that was 20th century history. Right now, we have so much good African American history as American history. African American history is American history. And more you will easily find by Googling your question, by following up on your book, you will find what you want to know. Not everybody wants to know the same thing. You will find it. The history is there now. You're absolutely right that every scholar, every journalist, every writer brings his or her own perspective. That is true. But history also has standards, and not everything can get into a book, say, from W.W. Norton, which was my publisher. And speaking of W.W. Norton, I want to tell you about a book that is coming out in the fall that is very helpful for the very topic we're talking about, which is reparations. Can you still hear me? Okay. The book is called, you see, I did my homework. Suggested reading on reparations from the Brookings Institution Why We Need Reparations for Black Americans by Rayshawn Ray and Andre Perry from the Brookings Institution. These are two Black authors, scholarly. And William Darity and Derek Hamilton, What We Get Wrong About the Wealth Gap. Whoa. Okay. I'm looking for a book about the Freedmen's Savings Bank. How many of you have heard of that? Okay, several, but not enough. This was a bank in 1865, set up supposedly for a savings bank for people who had been enslaved. Even though they had no right to make money, they had no right to have wealth, some of them had worked very hard and they had saved up a lot of money, which they put into the bank. Here it is. It's called Savings and Trust. Savings and Trust by Justine Hill Edwards. Savings and Trust. And it shows you one of the earliest examples of the theft of Black wealth. We often think, oh, slavery and Jim Crow made it impossible for Black people to accumulate wealth. They made it extremely hard, virtually impossible. But virtually impossible is not impossible, and some people managed to save money. They put it into the bank, and they lost it. The first example of the theft of Black wealth.
Yeah.
So I have a whole bunch of information here for you about reparations,
Yeah.
but I don't want to hog the microphone anymore.
No, thank you so much, because I feel like you have given us a teaser for what we're going to come back to, but I want to jump to your book, Jamar, because one of the things that, as I was reading your book, I was like, someone who like grew up in the Black church, right, and thinking about the church's role in all of this. And your book is a confrontation of the complicity of the church and racism. And when we're talking about the church, right, we're talking about the white church, right, and we're thinking about what role did the Black church do in counteracting that, and how can the white church, because still churches are some of the most segregated places in America to this day. And we're thinking about how can white churches really, when we're talking about reparations, do their role through the Black church. So can you, one, tell us, when you sat down to write this book, were you nervous? What were you thinking about? What were you were thinking the reactions of people were gonna be? And then two, because you do talk about reparations in this book, and you talk about the idea of reparation versus reparations, and you do it through the lens of the church, which was a really powerful orientation for me. So can you talk a little bit about both of those things? Like, how did this book come to be? And then talk about reparations through the lens of the church.
So the book that we're talking about right now is called The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. And that comes, it's partly autobiographical, where I was in predominantly white Christian spaces, and I'm like, y'all are getting so much wrong. And I feel so invisible and at the same time so harmed by a lot of what's going on here. And as I was doing my PhD and I'm reading about this history, if Christians ever came up, white Christians, they were usually on the wrong side of justice. And so that first book came about with me putting together these stories so that we could trace from the colonial era on up to the present time. And one contemporary connection, Oklahoma just passed this law that said you have to teach the Bible in public schools. Not teach about the Bible alongside other books, teach the Bible. And I'm like, okay, if you want to play it that way, then let's teach about what white people did with the Bible. And so let's talk about how they use this horrible interpretation of the curse of Ham to say that people of African descent were sentenced to slavery in perpetuity. Let's talk about in 1667, the Virginia Assembly, a group of white Episcopalian men passing a law that said baptism would not emancipate an African, a Native American, or a person of mixed race descent. Let's talk about pro-segregationist theology that came along right around Brown v. Board to justify the fact that God apparently ordained the separation of races. So you want to teach the Bible? Teach about what people did with the Bible. So that is part of the burden of the color of compromise. Now, when it comes to reparation versus reparations, I'm drawing on an author named Duke Kwon. Speaking of church folk, reparation is the principle that where there is harm, there must be repair. That shouldn't be controversial. In the book of Numbers, it says if you did something wrong to somebody, you got to pay them back plus 20%. In the New Testament, you have Zacchaeus, who was a Jewish tax collector. He defrauded Jewish people. Then he met Jesus. He got religion. He said he gave away half his possessions, and anybody he defrauded did it. He didn't just pay them back. He paid them back 4 times what he owed. So that's reparation. That shouldn't be controversial. Now, reparations, the specific recompense and repair owed to black people because of race-based chattel slavery, that's where the rub is, because white America has never wanted to confess or tell the truth about the harm it's done to black people.
Yes, and I think this goes right into Michael's book, where the chapter on reparations is called The Great White Heist. And are any of you familiar with Reddit? So there are these subreddits where I think this is important to Michael's book because there's a subreddit that's basically trying to explain complex ideas like racism to a toddler. And so in Michael's book, he has these chapters where he's talking to racist baby, RB for short sometimes, and he also has these like hilarious nicknames that he gives this racist baby, hypothetical toddler. And the chapter on reparations is told through racist baby asking questions about like, what are reparations? Well, my dad didn't own slaves. And you're like breaking down this argument for why reparations. So if I gave you like a 30-second elevator speech to sum that like chapter up, 1, why reparations? And then 2, what do you think would be beneficial, not only to black folks, because you're an economist, but to the economy, right? When we're talking about reparations, what does that do to stimulate our economy when we're really in need of some stimulation?
Okay, so first of all, reparations, we should always distinguish. Reparations are not just about slavery, right? Like, that was the original sin, right? But one of the problems I've posed as an economist and as in my book is that the post-slavery reparations might be larger than what is due for slavery. Think about this, right? After slavery, every black person in America had to pay taxes. We built college institutions that we could not attend. We built, like a state like South Carolina was majority black. It had 7 public universities, none of which could house, teach a black student, right? So their money was being stolen, their tax dollars were being stolen and given and used to fund the generational wealth of white people, right? Just think about all of those colleges that we couldn't attend. Just think about all of those schools, that K through 12 schools that we couldn't attend. Just think about all of the roads that we couldn't drive on and live on, and all the public utilities in the white neighborhoods that we couldn't do. And then we had to take the same thing, again, just back to what we said, and do it ourselves. Black people, the schools that black people attended were not built by white people. They were built by black communities. 30% of the people from 1920 to 1960 was educated in schools that were built by black communities, right? So people don't know that. Like, we educated white people's kids, and then we had to pay again for educating ours. So that theft for all of the black people, right, is probably larger than the slavery debt, right? And then your second question is, what does it do for the economy? Well, we know that crime is a socioeconomic problem. So giving the poorest section of this country what you owe them will help crime. It will help, like when people complain about welfare, look how much reparations will fix that, right? It's an economic stimulus. Every time we have a problem in this country, we know how to fix it. When COVID happened, what do? Oh, we could just send out people money because we know it works. When George Bush was president and the economy crashed, what do? Just send them out money because we know it works. It's an economic stimulus, and that's what reparations is. But again, we owe that money, right? And it is not like you're just giving it away. It helps all of the white people who don't get it will benefit from not having to pay taxes that go to welfare for, poverty-related programs. Reparations can help fix that. So it's not just a gift. It's a repayment of a debt that could stimulate all of the parts of the economy that white people hate to talk about because they think it's a government handout or a gift. Because white people have been the biggest beneficiary of the government handout since the beginning of America. And that is what reparations is about.
Come on. So in our last 4 minutes, I want to ask a question, and we're going to have to do like rapid fire here so that we can end on time. But I want to ask you all a question, and because I don't want to leave on like a pessimistic note. And I do feel like a lot of your books offer up ways to move forward. So if you could give folks in the audience today, like what can we as people do in this moment right now where it is so critical to take collective action, whether it's advocating for reparations, whether it's advocating for our history to not be an elective that you have to opt into. What are some action steps that folks can take in this moment right now? And we can start with you, Dr. Painter.
Sure, thank you so much. Also, I want to say thank you to Essence for having Vice President Kamala Harris yesterday. That was so uplifting. And she is going to defeat Trump. She is going to defeat Trump, absolutely. Okay, I come from Newark, New Jersey, and I have a wonderful mayor, Ross Baraka, who's the son of Amiri Baraka, and he addressed this very question of reparations in the local newspaper a couple of weeks ago, and so I kept that. And one of the things he says is that reparations means repair, which you just said, and he had a couple of things that I would like to advance on the local and state level. I'm not talking about national, local and state. One is guaranteed cash benefits to families, whether it goes only to certain families, only in Paterson, New Jersey, or for all families. This would be a great help to black families in particular, even if it went to everybody. And the second thing is investing in institutions like pre-K through 12 schools. And in Newark, it is a program called Office of Violence Prevention. All of this is either on the local or state level.
Thank you.
I'll say two things briefly. One, my second book is called How to Fight Racism, and so it's all about that. And what I offer there is a framework. Too often the problem is we give this scattershot approach. We'll do this, try that, all these bullet points that we can't keep track of. So what I offer is a framework called the ARC of Racial Justice. ARC is an acronym, A-R-C, stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Like the legs of a stool, we need all three, all right? So awareness is the information we need, relationships are the partnerships and the solidarity we need to advance, and commitment isn't just staying the course, it's a commitment to changing structures, policies, and institutions on a systemic level. So that's in How to Fight Racism. The second thing I'll say is, church folk, we don't have to wait for the government. If we're talking about reparations, we can do the right thing. Martin Luther King Jr. said, too often the church is an echo, not a voice. It is a tail light behind the Supreme Court and other secular institutions instead of a headlight guiding the way, right? So we can be the headlight as church folk, and if you had a black church, you probably have a relationship with some white church. Knock, knock, knock. Hey, what about this reparations thing? You think we can get together on that? And maybe the church can actually lead the way instead of waiting for politics or the government to do it for us.
All right.
Yeah,
close us
mine
out.
is really complex. It's give black people what we owe them.
Thank
That's
you.
it.
Period. Mic drop. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for this conversation. Thank you all for coming out. We appreciate you so much.